Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Father Peter Sabbath. I'm the pastor at St. Thomas Becket Parish in Pierrefonds, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our evening, which is called Renewing Fellowship with Indigenous People, with the Accos, Julie Lepage and David Acco. They are the co-founders of Accosis Consulting Services, Inc., which leverages an entrepreneurial business model to pursue a social mission for Indigenous inclusion and capacity building at the professional level. David is a Cree Métis, descended from Cumberland House, Saskatchewan, and a member of Métis Nation, Saskatchewan. Julie is a member of the Nipissing Ojibwe First Nation and a lawyer. And they're, as I say, co-founders of Accosis, and I've known them for many years. I had the privilege of celebrating their wedding in 2004 and of baptizing some of their 4 children, who range now in age from 7 to 15. They are committed members, longtime members of Holy Name Jesus Parish in Laval, and in fact did a similar presentation recently there. And we thought it'd be great to have it also for our parish and beyond. Present with us today is Father Michael Leclerc, pastor of St. Thomas Ignatius, St. Ignatius of Loyola Parish in NDG, and Father Robert Astley, pastor of St. Willibrord's and St. Thomas More parishes in Verdun. Father Raymond Lafontaine, the Episcopal Vicar for the English-speaking faithful of the Archdiocese, will be joining us a bit later in the program. And I also welcome our parishioners and others from around town who are with us this evening. We're recording here at St. Thomas of Becket, which is on traditional Mohawk land. Following the presentation of David and Julie, there'll be a time of questions which will be entered into the chat room, question and answer period, and then we'll conclude with a period of a time of prayer as well. So it's my privilege now to welcome David and Julie Acco.
The church is basically a grassroots movement, so it all started with 12 guys and one God, basically from all walks of life, and basically, speaking truth to power, which was the leadership at the time. So when we've been asked to do this, I thought about that and reflected upon that when we heard about the residential schools and what a Holy Name wanted to do, we realized that that was the grassroots movement that I guess we're all looking for to bring change. So I hope, and we know that the fact that, at least in our hearts anyways, we feel that it's going to be the laity that actually makes those particular changes as we work towards reconciliation. So I wanted to leave a little bit of that context before I get into it. Julie, you have some opening words you want to add?
No, I'm very grateful that we're here today with you. It's like David said, I'm also amazed with the number of people coming. It's really good because that, we're called to have a dialogue. And I like the last session, and when we do it with our own private clients, it's good to engage into a dialogue, to break stereotypes and have hope. That's what we're called as Catholics.
Yeah, to be agents of change. So with that, I'll get into it. So I'm just going to share my screen, and here's screen 2, screen 1, here we go. Okay, so I'll share this. So, and I'll bring your faces, wonderful faces, back up on my screen here so I can see you all. Just bear with me for a second. Oh, there you guys are. You're on the other side. Oh no, did I freeze? No, I didn't freeze, did I?
Oh, you're good.
No, we
Oh, good.
hear you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
So it's frozen on my side, on this side, but I'll assume that everything is going well. So just to give you a perspective, this course normally when I give it is it's basically a condensed version of, let's say, a year-long or a semester-long course in university. So if I was to dump a whole bunch of books on you, I would say, okay, these are the parts you need to highlight and you might get tested on. So I'm going to give you the Coles notes of Indigenous relations. Let me see. I'm going to stop
Can't
sharing.
see your screen though.
Yeah, your screen just says that you started.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, I think I might have froze on this end because I got nothing here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to crash my computer and I'm going to log back in. I apologize for this. Okay, sorry. I'll be right back. Hey, Julie, maybe you can tell a story or two while I'm doing this.
So yeah, I can tell the story. I know Father talked about Dave, that he was part of the Métis community, but since January of this year, he his uncle had made uh, a bunch of requests, and he's been appealing and to be recognized as a status Indian. It was the last will of his of David's grandmother, you know, that her son would do everything to have her recognized. And because all these years they didn't have any membership to a set community, so that's why they grew up speaking the language, living on the land, but not really knowing, you know, who their First Nation or their community they were from, or they were members of. And it's only in January that for David and my children, they were recognized as status Indian, you know, and that was, believe it or not, a 20-year battle in order to be recognized. So, you know, when we talk about hardships with Native people, you're going to see that's just a concrete examples, you know, of you know, going back and finding our roots and getting back in and finding our cultures, you know. And as for me, like Father Peter said, I'm a member of Nipissing, but however, I was born just here in Montreal at Sacré-Cœur Hospital. And for when I was growing up, my father would say we would go to Ganawage, which is near Mercier, right, over the Mercier Bridge, and he would say, "Oh, I'm Native," you know, but he didn't know where he was from. So it's only after the Yoka Crisis, you know, that I start writing and researching and trying to find where does my father comes from, right? Because I thought it was important he would know. He did not know his history, and he had a hard life. You know, he grew up on the street. So it's and that's when we found out that he was actually a member of the Nipissing, which is not even in Quebec. So he was just stunned that he was from Ontario, and he remembered, you know, his mother coming on her back in a canoe, but he did not know where he was from. And you could just tell, you know, the silence of the hardship, you know, not really wanting to talk about it. So it was very hard for him. And we went once to the community. It's a very beautiful community. So I was privileged to go there. And at the time we came, I'm sorry, my youngest is coming up. But at the time we went, there was a wedding, and the wedding was at the community center, and they invited us. So it was. Hold on. So we had the chance to attend a wedding, and I had the chance to meet with elder women, the kokums we call them, and they talked about my grandmother, you know, and how she lived in Nipissing, and that she had moved to another community because around the Nipissing Lake, there's many Ojibwes that live around there. So that's a bit of my story, and you'll see Dave has uh, the complete opposite story of myself, right? So we're really the yin and the yang. So he has a completely different story where the Indigenous people are not uneducated, and they're different, right? They're from out west. Just a second. All right, Dave, are you back? I didn't
Uh,
see you come in.
Alex is just contacting him.
Okay.
So yeah, you got to keep talking, Julie.
So like Father said, as part of our company, Acosis, we decided to start that in 2006. And it was just because David and I were part of, I'm an HR professional, and I went after, I went in my early 30s, I went back to school, to law school. And we decided that, well, we have a network, we know people in private sector, so let's start our own business. And through that, our business, we have a real strong social mission, which is we want to create our succession, basically. And we want to have more people like myself, professionals in HR, and like David, professionals in IT and consulting. So we have we hire stagiaires who are Indigenous. We give them a year of experience, salaried, and hopefully after that we can hire them, or they get hired by one of our clients. So we've been successful since 2006, but I can tell you it was not always rosy. So we had some hard years, but fortunately we turned a corner. In the past 2 years, we've turned a corner and we're doing better and better. So it's really good. Good times.
Thank you very much. And you've been active in the parish too over the years with the children and in
Yes.
different groups. Yeah.
Yeah, I was a lector before COVID, of course, at Holy Name of Jesus. We did the marriage preparation course. We were involved with the baptism team with at the baptism. We were on rotation, but when COVID happened, I mean, we're here and we're just slowed down a little bit.
All right, so David's back.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Julie. I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize.
No problem.
I apologize for that. It's guaranteed that something's going to happen when you're going to get into this stuff. So we live in the world of technology now. Well, we always did, but even more so. So I'll jump into it. I kind of left off saying that this usually takes about a full semester to kind of go through. So I'm going to apologize to you ahead of time. I'm going to make you drink through a fire hose. So buckle up, get ready, and open wide. So here we go. So you should see the next slide. Okay, so basically what this slide was given to me from another Indigenous person out in BC, is an artist named Mervyn Windsor. What Mervyn wanted to do is during if you guys remember around 1996, somewhere Quebec wanted to separate, but the BC knew no borders, so they don't see they see Canada as one unified country. And what he wanted to express is the fact that most Indigenous people live in this country. And the way we view the land, we don't see things in separation. So this is BC's this artist's point of view, and we figured that this was a real encapsulation of what we were trying to achieve, with our company and what we do. So we did the land acknowledgement, which is so important because I always like to talk about land acknowledgement as being sort of a new standard for Canada, in terms of understanding, Indigenous people and in our place in here. But most importantly about a land acknowledgement is a recognition of Indigenous people being here. When we do a land acknowledgement, it sort of basically outlines the fact that you exist, we exist, so, and I see you, you see me. And we're all just travelers in this land as we go through, our life journey, or just passing through at the very end of the day, and to ask permission to, to use the resources and so on and so forth. But land was given to us as, by the Creator. And that recognition. So I'm really seeing more and more land acknowledgement come in, not in just corporate Canada, but also in institutions and also in communal gatherings. So just an overview. one of the things we try to do is kind of give you a base of what the terminology is. There's a lot of, I would say, political correctness, and people are afraid. So we're going to just kind of dispel a few of those things. More importantly, I want to give you a historical context. And by that, I mean, what I want to show you is how did we, where it first came from, Indigenous people, to how did we, come into first contact and then become wards of the state. So that's kind of give you that perspective. The other thing I want to talk about is a timeline of events to bring us to why we are, at this particular juncture in Canadian history. And finally, I like to impart people with what can you do? What is your reconciliation potential. And then we'll, as Father said, we're going to open up to questions and so on and so forth. So just to let you know, I know this is being recorded. I don't want you to feel afraid to ask any question. And it could be something as something to you, a misconception that you might have had, or a basic understanding, and you just want to correct it. Don't worry about it. We're all good with that, that kind of thing. And I say the best place to learn about Indigenous people is around the water cooler. So, the spirit of the water cooler, the watering hole, let's, don't feel afraid to ask your questions. So let's go to terminology. One thing we were labeled and it stood for a very long time, are Indians. And this is basically because Columbus got lost. He thought he had hit the New World, or he didn't realize it was a new world. He thought he hit India, and just by the way we looked and so on and so forth. So he said, he called us Indians. This name has stuck, since Columbus up into the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Then Native, a Native got very confusing because it was Native Canadians, so somebody who was a second or third generation would be considered a Native, but he's totally European descendant. And of course, Aboriginal became another construct that people use, Aboriginal rights and so on and so forth. You'll see a lot of that. That was probably in the 90s, 2000 timeframe. But the Indigenous now is, the most accepted word, and which it just means indigenous to the land, one of the first peoples, like an indigenous plant, if you want to say. It's only here you can find it. Reserve is a construct that was brought in by the Indian Act, which I'll cover a little bit further, but really it's a community. It's a community of people like Laval or Montreal, or a borough, from that perspective.
Or your parish.
Or parish, yes, that's exactly it. So when you look at it from that point. And the other thing we'd talk about is a construct of a band, but a band was sort of something that was created again with the Indian Act, but also First Nations. So First Nations being the ones, that are sort of recognized by the government, but really that's a council. So it's no more different than any other city council or so on and so forth that help manage and govern with the groups of people from that. So it's our system of government. But it's not our system per se, because again, it's created by the Indian Act, and I'll go a little bit further on why that is. So Indigenous people. So I'm going to give you who are the Indigenous groups, okay, and kind of give you that recognition where, by what Canada sort of, and the recognition in terms of what groups are those under the Constitution. So basically there's 3 recognitions. Probably when you first came into Canada, you had your citizens test, they turned around and told you there's 3 groups: First Nations, Inuit, Métis, so that's, and they kind of leave it at that. People don't understand what exactly does that mean. So what I'm gonna basically show to you is, what does that mean? Okay, so giving you just by the numbers is there's 1.6 million of Indigenous people. That's a 2016 census. That number keeps on growing as more people find out their indigeneity and where they belong to. I think Julie was starting with a story about, I just recently got my band card, so I became First Nations officially, but Métis most of my life, non-status. So for a long time with the government, I was I wasn't First Nations. I had first, because I wasn't recognized by the government as a First Nation, so I became non-status. But Métis pretty well recognized from the Red River community. So this is sort of the number that's being out there. There's 52 nations. There's over 650 communities and about 52 different languages in Canada. So just kind of gives you a perspective of Indigenous people. So First Nations are basically governed by the Indian Act. Those are the ones that are recognized by the government. And it's about 618 nations and about 630 communities. I give you a perspective. My community from Peter Ballantyne Band. You could see like spots of it over once in Prince Albert, Pelican Narrows, Sandy Bay, I think it's called. So different communities. So that will make up one collective band, if you want to say, with the Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation. There's 50 nations, about 50 different languages within a First Nations group. Now, that's not counting dialects, okay? So if I take a look at the James Bay Cree, you could tell a Cree person where they come from just by the dialect. And oh, there's my guy. He's just finished taking a shower. So there you can turn around and tell somebody if they come from Shisasabe or they come from Waswanipi or they come from Waskaganish, just by the region. In my community, Cree, you could tell by Swampy Cree, within the land they live in versus, Plains Cree or Woodland Cree. And in there, there's even breakdowns of different dialects depending on what community you come from. So there's about 1 million Indigenous people in 2016, but that number again is growing and growing. You can put a 977, 231 now, because now I'm part of that group. So that number keeps on changing. Inuit. So Inuit and Inuktitut means the people, okay? And it says Indigenous groups that are kind of living around the polar regions. And so you kind of look at, if I just draw a line just around here, all the polar regions, where you can find the Inuit. Now, they are vastly different from First Nations, and they're really governed by the environment. So, the way they cook, the way they interact, the way the language are constructed, the technology is so much different than, let's say, the First Peoples. And that's where they govern and by that. So there's about 53 communities, and Inuit Nanagat is the whole particular regions, but they're made up of basically 4 different regions. And I'm going to apologize to my Inuit brothers and sisters because I'm going to butcher their name. Because there's a big caveat. I'm a dyslexic guy, so so the pronunciations are pretty hard. Inuit Valuit, okay, Nunavik, Nunavut, and Nunavut. Okay, so are the Métis basically the region? So we kind of look at them as provinces, and they're about 64 million or 64,000 Indigenous people running, Inuit people running around in Canada, and a lot of them are transit. So they live in their community, but they also live in the city. So Montreal is one of the bigger congregation of Indigenous people because of they come to work in government, they come to work, go to school, they're traveling for different work. So you see Inuit people in Ottawa, but also in the Northwest Territories as they come and work on different particular projects. So, so the other group that is more recognized is the Métis, and the Métis kind of trace their heritage, and what they call Métis was métis en français, which was mixed blood, So back in the day, they used to have a very derogatory term for Métis people. They used to call them breeds, because they had European and Indigenous ancestry, First Nations ancestry. So what happened, how did they get to that is and this is based on commerce. Well, we had Northwest and France and Hudson Bay and coming in from England. Basically, they recognized the fact that it was a matriarchal society. So in order for you to have access to territory, you basically encouraged their men to marry Indigenous women. And by matriarchal society, I mean possession or access to territory was basically passed on from mother to daughter and so on and so forth, and their children. So this made total amount of sense for them to approach it from this way. But what happened was they started to bring the best traditions, the best side of the European culture, but also the Indigenous culture. So land, trapping, technology, system of government, and so on and so forth, was being able to bring it. Susan Moody, one of the first colonial writers, talks about that being a new Canada, the mixing of the old world, the old old European world and the old Indigenous world as well. So she declared those are the real Canadians. But the thing about it is a lot of it is recognized around the Red River. So the Red River of Winnipeg, around this particular area. So the Métis homeland is sort of made up of areas of Alberta, Manitoba, areas in Ontario, but in Quebec there's no recognition of Métis people under the Constitution. So you have to be able to tie your heritage to the Red River communities. So that kind of gives you the overall compassing side of it. Let me take you down the history path here. So this is where you get your highlighter and you're able to turn around and say, okay, well, this is what the parts I have to know. So we've been here since time immemorial. And what that means is we've always been here. So by that, they tried the land bridge about 11,000 years ago. So you got to imagine Canada with a giant ice cap on top of it during the Ice Age. And there was the most accepted theory is that they came across a land bridge here following different seasons. They kind of realized that there was ice melting and so on and so forth. And what they ended up having is a corridor. Since it's a hunting gathering society, a group from Asia, mainly China, Mongolia, that area came in across the territory and found themselves on this side of the ice sheet, and it closed too. So there's a group that ended up around this particular area and started migrating east and migrating south. So there was an Anzac child found, basically, and somebody did a DNA test and found that there was just one particular chromosome that all Indigenous people share with that particular Anzac child who was 11,000 years old that they found around Dakota area. There's other theories that came in that you'll talk about is they came from Polynesia through South America. Those group was found there. That's a very controversial theory, because they come around the Maori. They look at the Maori people finding their heritage from the Philippines around that particular area, Hawaiians and so on and so forth. So possibly they came, as far as Easter Island and so on and so forth, making it into South America. There's another more controversial theory that comes. And this is proposed by Huron Wendakis, that there's an ice bridge that came across here because of the frozen ice and so on and so forth that allowed an opportunity for Indigenous people to come in from Europe. That is a pretty big controversial theory in terms of what it is, and just basically one group. And this is that's why we have blonde and blue eyes and so on and so forth. But this, you'll see some literature about that coming out. And when that's among us Indigenous people, that's a far blown theory. Julie, you want to add something to that? I know, because no, you don't want to. Okay, so you'll see a little bit of those articles coming out. But there's some important things I want to turn around and thinking about is, understanding the relationship, that the fact that there was 500, and I want you to hang on to that, okay? The statistic, they say pre-Columbian, there's only 500,000 people here, not very much, 2 million. But if you look at some books, they'll say there was 90 million of us running around here pre-Columbus. And DeSoto, in a book called Stolen Continents, DeSoto comes up the Mississippi, and he says he's run into a large-scale village every mile or so up the Mississippi. So in terms of that, so there's scholars that turn around and say that number sustains over 90 million when you take a look at it from the early journals or early codexes that they find. But most importantly, I want you to hang on to this, with the fact that we had a system of government. Okay, and if you look at the Iroquois Confederacy was built on a balance of power. They had 7 different tribes or organized groups of the Seneca, Iroquois, and so on and so forth, traditionally called the Mohawk. community was basically they had a balance of power. When Thomas Jefferson saw this balance of power, of how this group organized itself, trying to build consensus, he borrowed that and as a replacement for the monarchy, and created the balance of power that we see in the United States under Constitution between the judiciary, the executive branch, and of course the legislative branch, the Congress, and so on. And so he borrowed that. So there's a fine print on the American Constitution. But the fact is that they had this really sophisticated system of government, for governance, a judiciary system for for the way the society behaves and conducts itself. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is the fact that during first contact, well, Columbus is well recognized as, as being one of the first people to come across. There's other ones, the Vikings and so on and so forth, but let's hang on to Columbus here first. So 1492, he sails the ocean blue, but this is all about commerce, opening up new trades. Jacques Cartier comes in to Quebec, so on and so forth, about 1534, and shortly after that, Champlain. And then we begin this Franco-Indigenous alliance based on trade. So fur trade basically brings in sort of like peace and respect, and they want to get access to territory and so on and so forth. It's a fashion industry that's kind of driving this, but it's also causing conflicts between French and English. So those alliances become very, very important. And this is nothing new. The Spanish, when you look at it from the Inca and the Mayans, that's what they did. The Spanish kind of played a different dynamic, but they just basically played two nations against each other. In this particular case, depending on who you were, so if you were a Malisit or a Huron, Wendat, and so on and so forth, you spoke your language and you spoke French because of those alliances. If you were a Mohawk, you spoke English and you spoke Mohawk, and so, and this is the way it is still today. That's bilingualism. So it's along those alliances. So the first one, terra nullius, or the doctrine of discovery, planting a flag and so on and so forth. But what this doctrine holds on to, and remember I told you, hang on to that 500,000, 2 million number and so on and so forth, because it's really kind of governed around this. The doctrine of terra nullius is the land is empty. Nobody has it, we can make claim to it and so on and so forth. There's not 90 million people. So a lot of this the census data is becoming very cloudy or very milky along these particular lines of discovery. So, and you'll hear that, there's not a bunch of people, there were not very many Indigenous people here anyways, so, but more importantly, beyond that is the Franco, Iroquois Wars, which is kind of instigated along the lines of the English. And, as they're warring over this great, this new world, but they start building fortifying posts, trading posts. They start trading First Nations partners, strengthening their presence. And this is where you get into colonization, or the first inklings of colonization. But before it became colonization, there was this kind of respect for the first treaties. And the first treaties, you got to remember, a treaty is basically a nation-to-nation relationship. You don't have treaties between provinces, you have agreements, or you don't have treaties between cities. You basically have treaties between countries, and this is where this sort of recognition of a nation-to-nation relationship, and you'll see that come back a little bit further. So hang on to that portion of it. So what happens at the very end of the first treaties between the Iroquois and people were the British, but at the end of the war, the great peace between French and English and so on and so forth, the 1701 brings a great peace. And this, because wars are expensive, we all know that. So they needed peace. So that nation-to-nation relationship with the two-row wampum belt really spells out what the vision of Indigenous peoples view of what Canada would look like with the new within this new relationship. So fast forward, a lot of things happened, to get us to this particular point, but we started to become wards of the state. Okay, meaning that we become property of the state. So you had a whole group of people that are becoming now property. So the way they kind of did this was they started creating Indigenous affairs, and Indigenous affairs was, sort of like belonged to the army. So the army was the ones who enforced it, and it was basically around, commerce. So in order to look at how to get access and how to, basically get into the territory for commerce. And then we start seeing the first secessions of land. So the first treaties and the creations of the first reserves. And a reserve is basically something that says, I'm going to move people out from I'm going to reserve a particular piece of land for, for this particular community. So treaties, like you'll see, treaties being formed, for a land, a particular land. So Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3, and you'll see them scattered all over Canada, or as the train moves forward, as they're building the railroad. And the way, it's what it is the number treaty by when they settled. So Treaty 1 was the first one, Treaty 2 was the second, to Treaty 7, and so on and so forth. But inside of there was these particular treaties that started building in assimilation politics or assimilation policies. So what are assimilation policies? So basically assimilation 1820, they start coming out and through Aboriginal affairs, which is enforced by the army. They begin to wanting to civilize Indigenous people, starting to assimilate them into the Canadian or into this new world fabric or this new country that they're trying to build. So the first laws enacted in Lower Canada, 1850, how to govern Indigenous people. They start separating tracts of land, uses for certain tribes, and then they start encouraging this gradual civilization politics for the wild tribes into the province of sort of a united Canada. The number of treaties I talked about, but then what happened is the federal government starts taking the jurisdiction of the Indians, so that kind of thing. So they create the Indian Act, and inside the Indian Act was the establishment of residential schools. So what is the objective? So this very nice guy, Duncan Campbell, he basically kind of just spells it out for you. So it's basically Indians now are viewed as a problem. So in terms of how do you get rid of the Indian problem? Well, you know what? They want to be absorbed into the body of the political bodies, and in a way we're going to breed them out. So we're going to, and be able to eliminate Indian people, so they will no longer exist. And then to say if they no longer exist, they're no longer a problem, and we can continue marching forward as a country. So this was the whole point of the whole objective of the Indian Act. And how they do that? Well, they had basically two pillars, which basically they had control over the citizenship. So Julie turned around and told you it took me 30 years to become a First Nations person, having to prove and show to the government and so on and so forth, and write letters and all the rest of this kind of stuff with my uncles, to do all this particular work. And that was control over the citizenship. So there'll be no new members. And the way I also do it is that you got two classes. You got C1, C2. So C1, which is now I am, and I think Julie is right now because of the changes in the laws. They basically say you can pass status. So you can pass it down to your children, and your children, if they don't marry an Indigenous person, they can pass C2, which means their children can't pass it on. But if they marry Indigenous men and women, they can pass on their status of C1. So Julie and I are C1, or that kind of, or I don't know if she's still C2, but because she has children with me, because I'm C1, our children become Indigenous. So it gets that convoluted in terms of government identifying who you are. So control over the citizenship. Then as governance. So the control over the governance is that, that whole system of government that you had before and everything that was organized, we're going to disband that. We're going to fall into that. We're going to be able to, how you manage yourselves, we're going to decide that. So every 2 years, there has to be a band election of new leadership. Now, Canada has every 4 years. Indigenous people have every 2 years. So you'll be able to constitute and organize yourself and so on and so forth. You got to change the government. you know, and we know the effects of a change in government, how that destabilizes, and you can't coalesce along those lines. So you have management control, and you have control over education, you have control over water, you have control over housing. So you can see where, you know, the whole idea of being able to control a society. In that control, we have residential schools, which kind of takes us to where we are today. So residential schools opened up in 1833, most of them, and they were mandatory. So at the age of, I believe it's 4 or 5, you have to go to residential school, so you're 15. Now, you know that the fact that there was a child that was discovered that was 3 years old. So even then, I'm kind of questioning on that, you know. So the last residential school, now hang on to that number, 1996, okay, where it closed its doors, and there's a reason for that. But generally speaking, the residential school's function was basically doing something, right? You have a parent, you have a child, and you want to break that bond, okay? So you want to make sure there's a loss of culture, so you have a loss of language. You also got a loss of family ties, and so on and so forth. So you break it nice and early, then you can reconstruct the person. But inside of that, there's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse, well documented with the oblates and all the rest of this kind of stuff. But what happens is you get sort of intergenerational trauma. And I'm actually reading this thing on colonialism, you know, doing for a paper. And what they looked at is this intergenerational violence, intergenerational depression. And what people start realizing, and it's been a proven fact, that when you have trauma, it actually changes your genetic code. So the next group is susceptible to suicide, susceptible to alcoholism, susceptible to violence, and so on and so forth. And that's what the causes of intergenerational trauma does. It weakens the body, weakens you know, the mind, the body, the soul. So there's 150,000 Indigenous children that were removed from their homes, forced by the RCMP or the Army at the time, and so on. But hang on to that Army, because I'm going to come back to you. Okay, so and basically they were moved into those particular residential schools. And what has happened is there's death records. So they have only looked at 15% of the death records and they identified there's about 4,200 unnamed death records of children. But you got to remember, it's only 15%, and the government has destroyed records as well. You know, so to give you a perspective. So this is where the residential schools are. So it's across Canada. They're far from reserves. A lot of children died trying to escape a residential school and trying to walk home. So they ended up freezing to death at the very end of the day. They would find their bodies a few miles away, you know, and we're talking little children. So they actually tried to come back to their homes. So you have, you know, no means of being able to travel back home. So those whole family ties and of loss were broken. When you look at it from this perspective of being in a residential school, if you went to war, okay, your chances are, you gotta imagine a platoon of 30. Anybody who's been in the Army kind of knows what I'm talking about. Your chances of dying in that particular platoon, okay, out of 26 people, one person will die, you know, guaranteed. In a residential school of a class of 25, one person is going to die. Either they're going to freeze to death, they're going to get die of abuse, or they're going to die of sickness, you know, so because they're all so crowded in. So that was your chances of survival. So you can imagine grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and so on and so forth, of what as you're going through this. But what this also caused, the Indian Act and also the fact of residential schools and this control over wealth and income. It's very hard to have wealth as being an Indigenous person. Under the Indian Act, we didn't have any property. So if I wanted to buy a house, I couldn't go to the bank because the bank would say, give me some collateral, some land, and so on and so forth, but you couldn't have any. So we couldn't get a loan. You know, so but we had government housing and whatever that government housing was looking like, or band provided housing, but I couldn't get a personal loan. I couldn't build any personal wealth. The other side of the coin, as an Indigenous person, criminal justice, we know the fact that the majority of Indigenous people that are incarcerated are Indigenous people. So that was one thing. So you can imagine this, you know, looking at, oh, well, it's a bad society, you know. Unemployment and education, you don't have to look very far, you know, to statistics right now. Housing and healthcare. We had, believe it or not, Jordan's principle. Now, giving Jordan's principles point of view, is this is where we had an Indigenous child. He was born with, very health problems, very chronic health problems, and he was he was living his last life in a hospital. The family wanted to bring him home to die at home, with him around his community. But he needed special care. So he needed oxygen tanks, he needed sun, he needed therapy, and so on and so forth, transportation. And the provinces basically, because of the way the jurisdictions work, the province said, we're not paying for it, and the federal government goes, well, no, it's a jurisdiction issue. It's a provincial issue. No, you're going to pay for it, So this went back and forth, and the child ended up dying in the hospital. So it became a human rights crime. Cindy Blackstock was looking at it and developed Jordan's principle, which is a child first policy. And this was just recently, up to maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that was taken care of, this finger pointing. So what the government turned around said, human rights said, it's child first, okay? And you guys can fight about the bill later, okay? So that was one thing. That's what it took. And we're still having these particular issues to this day. And of course, political power. AFN is not a government. It's a lobbying group. ITK is what the Inuit side is, again, it's not a government. So this system of government is, we're still trying. So you talk about Indigenous self-government and so on and so forth, getting back to those fundamental principles. But generally speaking, it also caused perceptions with you guys, with everybody. Oh, you Indigenous people want everything and this, and you want free, and you get free Medicare, and you get so on and so forth. But if you really understood the whole construct behind it, you'd be going, wait a second here, in terms of what but it caused this racism, this disparity. And the other thing the Indian Act did was it separated two policies, because an Indigenous person had to stay on his reserve. So in other words, just up until 1974, when the church bells rang, you had to be, there was a curfew. Every Indigenous person had to be at their home and the gates would close. And there was an Indian agent that prevented you guys from visiting us, at the end of the day. The Indian agent controlled who came to see who at the very end of the day. So that's why you have this great divide and these great disparities in optics, so from that standpoint. So I'll go through some of these stereotypes here, but generally speaking, we don't get along with each other. You hear that a lot, but when you have difference of opinions, so many people, and so on and so forth, that difference of cultures and needs, it's natural. French and English people don't get along. Some French people from Manitoba don't get along with people from Quebec. They have different views, so from that side of the point. So you don't have to look very far. Indigenous people don't pay taxes. I break the news here. We do pay taxes. It depends. There's the way the tax structure is set up. There's 3 tests. You got to work on reserve or work for Indigenous people. You got to be Indigenous, recognized by the government, and the other thing is where you do your work, so that kind of determines. So yeah, you pay taxes just like everybody else does. Indigenous don't pay for electricity. I know only one company that has an agreement, but we all pay electricity, so. The other side, Indigenous receive a check from the government. Okay, so let me give you a perspective on that. So treaty with script, the government said, okay, back in when they first settled it in the 1800s, they said, we're going to give you $4 per every person. That number has not changed. It is still in 2021, $4 for every Indigenous person. That's taken script. So that's what it is. So misconceptions, again, people don't want to integrate, collaborate, so on and so forth. We didn't want to be assimilated. When the bottom line is, we want to continue having our identity, our values, and so on and so forth, like anybody else does. So that's, again, it's one of those perceptions. The other side of the coin is Indigenous people don't want economic development. We want economic development, but it's not at any cost. It's not at the cost of the land and so on and so forth, but they want to be consulted on what that economic development looks like. The other thing, Indigenous people are stuck in the past. I hear this a lot, okay? So get over it. Okay, get over residential schools, get over, the injustices and so on and so forth. But they're here and now. And I'm going to take you, when I take you through the modern day side of it, you'll see what I mean. Indigenous people are alcoholics and homeless and so on and so forth. There's a book called Hidden in Plain Sight. So you do see some Indigenous people who walk downtown and there's alcoholism and so on and so forth. but that's really linked to intergenerational trauma, which you talked about a little bit before. But there's also the Julies and myself and so on and so forth that are there, that are just basically hidden in plain sight. For the longest time, I was not viewed as an Indigenous person. I was viewed as a very tall Filipino. Okay, I could say, "Oh, you're Filipino." And I say, "No, I'm Indigenous." How come you're not, poor? How come you're not this? How come you're not that? In terms of their perception. So now I can take you the words and say, how did we get to this activism that we are now? And there's a bunch of court cases. Okay, so I want you to take a little bit back, because this is a story I found out from my mom. How did I end up on this side of the world? Because my family comes from Winnipeg. I was born in Winnipeg. My family has come from Saskatchewan. My uncle is the lieutenant governor of Saskatchewan. Got great family and so on and so forth. But my story really comes in from the 60s scoop, because when my mother was born, when I was born, my mother already had 2 children, and my dad had just lost his job. So what happened was, the 60s scoop, the replacement was the child welfare system. So you had nurses and social workers running around to Indigenous women's beds to say, "Do you want to give up your children? You want to give up your children? You want to give it?" So if they found one excuse, they took away your children. So when that happened to my mom, when they came up to her and said it, my mom said, "We got to get out of town." So my dad literally picked us up, and 2 weeks later, I was in Trinidad and Tobago, where my dad was from. My dad worked there for a few years, but when they decided to come back to Canada, they didn't go back to the prairies. They ended up on this side, as far away as possible from the 60s scoop. So that's how I ended up here. So it's very relevant and very hard for me to get over it, because this is my life. And you got to remember that we are the children, the first generation past residential schools. So that's something to think about. So the generation you're looking at, the 20s, are products of the first generation that are outside of residential schools. Couple of things that happened. One is the Calder case. So things were being pushed up to Supreme Court. Treaties were being pushed up and said, okay, you got to respect treaties. So the government, the Supreme Court reinforced it. And then it was enshrined in the Constitution, treaty rights. Other things happened was the Meech Lake Accord kind of getting the awakening of the renewal movement of the separatist movement. And that's where you see that painting of 19 that I showed you at the beginning. Hey, we exist too, so on and so forth. So there was actually a referendum held from the Cree where they voted to be part of Canada, so the other side of the coin, and this is another part of my story as I turn around and tell you, and it's still relevant to this day because it formed my activism, was the Yoka Crisis. So I'm in the military, I'm happily moving along, being an aircraft mechanic, paying for university and so on and so forth. Then the Yoka Crisis hits. Now, being in the reserves, we're called up, we're fueling up helicopters. I know a bit of my past thanks to my mom, and enough to have an understanding of, Indigenous people and history and so on and so forth, thanks to my grandparents and going back and forth to Saskatchewan. And I'm there like fueling up helicopters that are going to fly over people that I know and so on and so forth. And I'm an Indigenous person, and this is not feeling good. At the same time, I had to go back to my regular job and become an Indigenous apologist, explaining to what the Constitution, this is not just about a golf course or stuff like that. This is about land. This is about control over land, and trying to explain that. And you know what who they called to enforce it? They called the army. So they've been doing this since the beginning. And this is the army being called again to quell an uprising, if they want to say. So that's the Yoka Crisis. So when you look at it from what comes next, is out of the Yoka Crisis, Canada was thoroughly embarrassed by what it saw. Because at the same time, they were promoting truth and reconciliation in South Africa. They were turning around and saying, you're treating your Indigenous people really bad and subjugating them and so on and so forth. So when South Africa kind of looked at the Yoka Crisis, said, Canada, what are you doing? And this went up to the UN going, what are you doing? So Canada had to take a really perspective of itself. So they created the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And what's the Royal Commission, or RCAP did, was the first time Canada asked Indigenous people about Indigenous people. What are you suffering? What are you going through? What's, they talk about, and they came up with this volumes of looking at economics, wealth, they're looking at health, and so on and so forth. And you really started to understand that the systemic issues of what, because normally these were decided in the university hall. So there are anthropologists and so on and so forth that are kind of giving government advice on how to work with Indigenous people. Okay, so outsiders were telling us government how to do that. And so that's what 1991. Now, out of the Yoka Crisis, the Royal Commission report, the government, one of the first recommendations came out of the RCAP was close all the residential schools. So when the RCAP was released in 1996, that's one of the first things that they did. They also said, start an Indigenous Day. We have to change the dialogue. So they started an Indigenous Day for Canadians to get more educated and connect to the Indigenous people. So the other thing that it kind of started kicking off the rights of Indigenous people at the UN. So this is where UNDRIP, you heard about it, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and this sort of put a sort of global framework. Canada signed up to that, and of course we had the apology. If anybody remembers the apology, it was an emotional moment for Canada. The Prime Minister was almost in tears. People were almost in tears, and it was almost an emotional let go of the intergenerational trauma, not only for Indigenous people but also for non-Indigenous people as well. In terms of that, pent up, emotion of wanting to get to some sort of reconciliation. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out. And of course, this is where we're looking at residential schools and its implications. Inside of the RCAP, also looking at the murdered and missing women and Indigenous girls. So this is because this commission was formed because the highest incident of unsolved murders in Canada were Indigenous women, and they were not taken seriously by police. So either no, they're probably, runaways, they're probably drunk in the streets, so on and so forth, or they committed suicide, we don't know about it, and so on and so forth. Julie worked on the murdered and missing women's, the MII, the murdered and missing women's, Indigenous women's and girls. Julie, you want to say a few words on that? Because I know you worked on this one, just to give a more personal perspective.
Yeah, I didn't work in 2015. I was in 2004, actually. I work with the person who did the rapporteur from Amnesty International that brought it to the UN. And then she became the president of the Native Women's Association Canada, and she was my mentor. She helped me finish my articling in Ottawa, and I was moonlighting with her. We were traveling the halls of government, preparing questions for the minority government, to push this issue further. And I remember we're in Ottawa at the time, and I was inviting Dave to just walk into the street, as protest, and he was the only man, and that's when they realized, listen, women, we give birth to daughters, but we also give birth to sons, and we have spouses who are men. So that's when they started I forgot the name, Dave, for men to support their daughters and their spouse who have been missing or murdered, and no inquiries have been put into. So it's important because these girls, these women came from a family. Yes, they had social issues, but they lost their ways. So
Yeah.
It's
The one Julie's talking about is the Mooseheid Campaign, and what that Mooseheid Campaign was basically, a hunter was being teaching other hunters how to find bodies, so that kind of thing. So they started clip Mooseheid and they started giving it to men for against violence against women. It started with Indigenous men, but now it's gone through. So that's what the Mooseheid Campaign does. The Viens Commission, my colleague Eric looked at it for public servants as well, racism within public servants. The report gets released, and that's where it pointed out, the lack of people police intervention, and then finally, there's a tremendous amount of work to still be done. Joyce Ashukan. Everybody know, I hope that people heard about it from here, on how she was neglected to death by health workers who just basically said, she's a drunk Indian, she's had too many babies, she was only good for sex, and so on and so forth, let her die. So that report came out. And of course, the report came in for the release of the report that found out, that covered that. And last but not least, the discovery of the bodies in Kameloops. So, and this number keeps on growing and growing as we find out more. But just to give you perspective, it was not the government who sponsored it. It was actually the community. The community bought the equipment, hired people to find the bodies. And they were begging the government for the longest time. They said, listen, NRCan has lots of ground penetrating equipment. Can we use it? No, 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 no. We need it for other things, and so on and so forth. And then what happened when they found the bodies, the government turned around and said, we got lots of equipment for you. Let's go for it. So this is where, you know, a little bit of truth that comes out of that on now the government's participation in this. Okay, so we have the truth and reconciliation side of it. And I just want to take you quickly. There is under Truth and Reconciliation a call for the church. And I wanted just to really kind of zero in on that just for a moment or two. And I know we're kind of running into overtime, so I apologize. TRC Commission recommendations. I'm just going to stop presenting for a second and just zero in on the church call to action. And you can find it here. And this is really interesting. And this is where I want to activate the laity when you look at it. Church. Just bear with me for a second. I had it all teed up for now. Okay, so here we go. On the calls to action. Can you see it? Hopefully you can. Okay, so
it's a bit small, David.
Okay, let me zero in on. Let me just see if I can make it bigger. Is it better?
Fantastic.
Better.
Okay, okay. So I'm just going to move this a little bit so I could just talk about this. So there's calls to action for the church, you know, and I won't go through all of them, but one of the things is this is where you could turn around and see. We call upon the Pope to issue apology to survivors. This is like one of the biggest ones and the first one for that. So the Indigenous people are begging for that. They want to have that, you know, at the very end of the day, you know, or we call it settlement agreements. There's an outstanding agreement of 25 billion that's out there that still has not been settled. So one of those things that need to, and ongoing education. We're at the very beginning of this education. This is the first time we're actually doing this, and it took such a catalyst, but we're getting there, you know, and leaderships and parties to, you know, educate clergy and about the history and the legacy of it. So we have to kind of look the ugly truth in the face and try to understand it. I know there's interfaith groups, and I think Father Westfall is part of that. He talks about, you know, the connectivity between Indigenous people and having a monastic God before there was even, you know, before the church came. So this inherited, calling it the Great Mystery. But at the very end of the day, it's like, when you look at it, it's just not about settlement, but it's also about that whole side of reconciliation. And I always go back to that reflection that I had of 12 men, one God, grassroots movement, you know? So you can take these, this moment to turn around and look at the TRC and say, okay, how can we do this? How can we get involved? And this is nothing new. So I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to stop sharing this one. I'm going to go back to my presentation very quickly. And here we go. So how can we get involved? So I'm just going to skip across these ones. Okay. We talked about UNDRIP, you know, how can we get involved at the very end of the day? How can we activate ourselves? One of these things about Indigenous Peoples Day is this is your day as well, okay? Because it is so, Indigenous people only exist in Canada. Mohawks only exist, Métis people, Cree like myself, Ojibwe like Julie, and so on and so forth. We're the part of that great identity that Indigenous people, and so non-Indigenous people embracing that identity and participating in that celebration is one way of bringing reconciliation. I see you, you see me. I acknowledge you. You're here. We're proud of you. This is what Indigenous Day was to bring, but also a time for us to really try to understand each other as well. So one of the first things I asked Father to do, very sheepishly at the very beginning, say, hey, it's Indigenous Day. Could you give a special prayer and intention, and I was like, I should be sheepish about this. I should demand this, at the very end of the day. One of the things I also remember with Father Peter was I used to go to the sacristy and I used to, pray, and there was a picture of Brebeuf being tortured and killed by Indigenous people. And I said to Father, hey, Father, this is not cool, just sit there and just be reflecting upon that. And he graciously took it down and put a picture of Kateri Takapuita, which was now sits there to this day. Those are the kind of acts of reconciliation and celebration that could that's able to happen in your own space, in your own world. I'm still sharing. Oh, am I sharing my screen here?
We don't see
share. Oh, there we go. Can you see it now?
No.
coming.
Yes.
It's coming.
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, okay, there it is. Okay, so the other side of the coin is, what can you do? Well, there's things that need to be done, okay, and there's things that the ability to do, So I used to have this. She was a great spiritual director. She asked me one question: was what can an 80-year-old woman do? And she said, you can pray. A 17-year-old can march or stand or participate. Families can participate. So when you look at it, we all have this role in reconciliation. And what I also found this picture, and one of the things that stood out, church activism has always been there at the very end of the day. Social justice has always been there. And at one particular point in time during the civil rights movement, the church was really activated. They, marched on the bridge. They got beaten up by cops and all the rest of this kind of stuff, in terms of it. They found a third way, at the very end of the day. And that's why I'm encouraging at the very end of the day is, let's find the third way in what we can do in terms of reconciliation. So I don't want to fight. I don't want to flight. I really want to have that third way, in terms of what we can do as a laity, as a church. Finally, how can you get involved in your, instead of, I don't encourage you to go out there and riot and get beaten up by the cops or anything like that. At the end of the day, I kind of look at it and say, you can do this. This is your sphere of influence, So when we look at it, one of the things is, and I'm really pleased about it because I look at the numbers here, I think it was over 80 or something like that. Be curious. This is 80 curious people, notwithstanding the 2 people that are here. So I'm hoping there's about 100, at the very end of the day. And this curiosity is one of the things, because it really brings that desire for, watching movies, educating yourself, reading literature, and so on and so forth. Also looking for ways to, expand your knowledge, but not be afraid to ask a question to a David or a Julie or, other Indigenous people that are around you, to understand and have those hard conversations, because hard conversations are good, so as they open up the door. Land acknowledgements. Thank you, Father, for that land acknowledgement, because that's a very important piece of it. I see you, you see me. We're going to go to a nation-to-nation relationship. Finally, also that learning about Indigenous artists. Top tip, buy Indigenous art is becoming very popular. So from the original artists. Friendship centers. We have a friendship center here. I sit on a board of the Montreal Friendship Center. And friendship centers are exactly what they are. They're friendship places. So they're places for non-Indigenous people, Indigenous people, attending powwow. They have the grand opening. It's all nations, So they talk about our red brothers, our yellow brothers, our black brothers, our white brothers, and so on and so forth. And they have this grand opening of welcoming, and everybody comes into that recognition. National Indigenous Day, orange t-shirt. I hope that orange shirt day the church does participate in that. And that's this orange shirt day was instituted because a girl from residential school wanted to wear orange, but she wasn't allowed. So as a sign of silent protest, all the children in schools now, in elementary schools, they wear orange. And this is becoming those orange badges, orange ribbons, and so on and so forth. This is something that's so easy to do. Participating in powwows, and of course, organizing fundraising events, and we do that for dans la rue and all the rest of the places like that. But we can also do for the women's native shelter, the women's shelter, and other organizations that bring that reconciliation. And the most important thing, and that's something I tell everybody, denounce racism. When you hear it, denounce it. call it out for what it is. And racism was one of the most insidious things. And I'll give you a perspective on this and on my personal story. I went to work, I was hero to zero. People did not understand. They thought I was a Filipino, as I mentioned, and so on and so forth. But I wore my Indigenous colors they became, oh, Indigenous people are lazy, or Indigenous people, all those stereotypes and so on and so forth. Oh, you're Indigenous, therefore you must be lazy, and so on and so forth. Then it shows up on a job performance. So I went from hero to zero in less than a year because I wore it on my sleeves. But the thing I did not do is I did not address it. I laughed at it. And that kind of thing, because I couldn't find any words, on how to address it. I did not know how to address it, at the very end of the day. So when someone asks me, how do you address, so when you see something, how do you call it out? Call it out. I'll give you the opening phrase. That is not cool, and basically why it isn't. And speaking truth to power, I had to do that, and I had to learn to do that, even in my business relationships. So in conclusion, there's still so much to do. We got a lot of work ahead of us, and so on and so forth. So I want to activate the grassroots to start on this journey with us. Non-Indigenous people, Indigenous people, education is the key. We did the first step. You learned a little bit about Indigenous people. There's 100-something people here tonight that know more about Indigenous people than the average Canadian. That's something to think about at the very end of the day. So you got to impart that knowledge and finally contribute in your own way. If you're 80 years old, pray, or come, show up, at the very end of the day. If you're out, find a friendship center, join other families. That's where we can really start to build reconciliation and contribute. Even for the clergy, contribute from that side of the coin, and by doing this, that is that virtue, that contribution. So I'm so pleased to do this twice. So I'll leave you with that words as I go on to the next one. But Julie, please, if you have some thoughts, and I hate dominating. I feel like got the sound of my own voice here. I'm starting to love it.
It was good. It was all good. The other thing I just want, just to get the perspective. I remember David's mom. She would always say, she went to residential school. She didn't have one of those horrible experiences, and that was, we were grateful to God. But at the end of the day, what I've learned through my involvement with the Native Women's Association of Canada is that, I told Dave, I said, well, there was something negative about it because you don't speak Cree. And the first thing I've noticed when I've met Dave's mom before I met him, and she would be having those discussion in Cree, and I would just sit there and I love to hear the language, And I think that even though she had a positive experience, at the end of the day, she had 6 children and none of them speak Cree. So it had an impact. And David is the only one who, like he says, where is Indigenous, outwardly. The others don't, for all years, they don't recognize. So there are some effects that are not necessarily overt, but that the intent of as you saw, the intent of the residential school, why the setup, the Indian Act, it is there. It doesn't have to be horrific, but there's still an impact. And my children today do not speak Cree. So it's, that's the legacy, right? And, if you're Italian or Greek, it's one of the first things they say. Any European coming to Canada, the children, they speak 3 languages. They speak the language of the house, French and English. And unfortunately, for, like David says, for Indigenous people, they're bilingual, but French and Indigenous language, or English and their Indigenous language. So that's just food for thought.
Yeah.
So,
I just
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, just to add that little thing on my own personal story. It was really interesting. I had a conversation with my brothers, and I was telling them I was going through my status card. And the first thing my brother turned around and said, my oldest brother, he said to me, "But David, we're not Indigenous." And I said to them, last time I checked, me and you came from the same mom, so it just that whole viewpoint. And it caused me pause that half my family would recognize indigeneity and the other half would not. They recognize their Chinese heritage or the Trinidadian heritage and so on and so forth, but they would not recognize that Indigenous heritage because it carried so much baggage, from that side. So, just for food for thought in terms of that, how could a family be split right down the middle?
Thank you very much. Before I say anything more formally, the chat room is going to be open now. So this is the time, if you have comments or questions, to write them down, and John is going to sort them out and put them together. They're going to be asked anonymously. So feel free, as long as you're using appropriate language or not using inappropriate language, to ask any questions you want. We'll try and get to them. I have to say, Julie, you're right, but I do hear from many Italian and Greeks and others that this generation is not learning the language of their parents or grandparents either. So it's something there. But I do want to thank David and Julie for taking the time to provide this presentation to us at this particular time. It's the history in general is very complex. This history is complex. It is sensitive, and I for one have been aware of how ignorant I am of the history in general. Little bits that we learned in school way back and here and there. So I've been appreciative of learning even just the terminology. Native, Indigenous, Aboriginal, Indian is clear to me now. On the land acknowledgement, when I first went to the Holy Land in 1979, I'd never thought about it before, but I thought, this is my land, because those of you know I have a Jewish background, and I really had the strong sense that we were living here in Canada on land that belonged to the Indigenous people. And I guess as a Jew who's a Catholic, something I never thought about before tonight either, I can identify in a little way with you in terms of the complexity of our relationship with the church. We're fully who we are, fully Catholic, but it's a bumpy history that's there for sure, isn't it? And they spoke of David's mother. David's mother and sister often come here to St. Thomas of Becket, so maybe I'll have a chance to meet her at least one of the baptisms of their child that I performed. His mother did a beautiful, is it a smudging ceremony? I'm not sure.
It's a naming. Yeah, it's a naming ceremony.
It was part of that was added into our regular baptism ceremony. That was very, very beautiful. So while they're still working on the questions, I'll thank you again. I'd like to thank everyone who's here. Father Ray LaFontaine, the Episcopal Vicar for the English-speaking Catholics of the diocese, came in a bit late. Again, Father Robert and Father Mike, and a special thank you to Kevin Rada, who's the catechetical and youth minister at Holy Name Jesus. He organized their event, and his help in putting this together tonight was really invaluable. So thank you very, very much, Kevin, much appreciated. And we apologize to everyone. We started a few minutes late. There's, even when the House of Commons goes Zoom, they have technical issues too. So it's we're all on a learning curve, and we're all at the mercy of things. So I'm going to ask John if he's ready to begin.
Yep, I'm here. Questions are coming in fast and furious. I'm trying to keep up. But, so thank you everybody for your contribution. I just a personal comment. Thank you, David, for that extensive list of how we can get involved. It's just such important and critical things. And I pray that our hearts, our desires and actions can blend wholly together to get that done. All right, so we got one question here. What would you say to people who are contemplating renouncing their Catholic or Christian faith upon learning of the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, no, actually, you know what? It's not that tough when I'm thinking about it. I'll try to answer part of it, and I'll let Julie give her views on it. I think it's a tragedy if they do, that kind of thing. And one of the things I learned about being in the church and so on and so forth, we represent the body of the church. At the very end of the day, we are the church. I'd rather have these conversations within the church body than outside of it. And the reason why is, again, Oka experience. When I went through Oka, I like the military, and I'm back in the military, and so on and so forth, because I really think service to your country is very important. But when I left it, I felt very disenfranchised. I split. I left the military for all the wrong reasons, when I should have stayed in. And what I realized that in the military, they went through a reconciliation themselves. The army will never be called up again against Indigenous people. Mark Miller said it. The army will never, under his watch, will be called up against Indigenous people. And one of the things is that part of that reconciliation, when they had to go through the army. Now they have powwow grounds and so on and so forth. They changed to have cultural safety in a way that Indigenous people can now wear their braids and so on and so forth. So and this is right now, it's enshrined inside of the dress code within the military. I missed all that. I was outside of that fence and complaining and shaking my fists for all the wrong reasons, instead of coming in and figuring out how to participate. How do we bring reconciliation? So for those who are trying to think about renouncing the faith, no, now's not the time to renounce it. In fact, now's the time to really embody it, and become those agents for change within the church. The church is not a perfect place. It's made of men and women that are totally imperfect. It's only our God that's perfect. And he started off with 12 very imperfect people. So if anybody to turn around and look at those, to galvanize around just that kernel of thought, we're imperfect, okay? But it's better to be within a church to be imperfect, to find your perfection. I think.
Yeah, Bishop Albert Barron, in his little book he wrote after the sexual abuse crisis, he said, "This is not the time to bail out. This is the time to fight to make a better church."
Yeah, absolutely.
I see it.
Yeah.
Don't cut off our nose to spite our face.
Yeah.
Giving up our faith. Okay, John, is there another question?
Oh, Julie, Julie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you took my quote from the last meeting.
So my chips are all in. So there you go.
So we have the next question. Do you recommend that parishes begin Mass by acknowledging the land claims of Indigenous peoples?
That's an interesting question. I would like to see it on an Aboriginal Day. That is a real time to really take it, or during events. If the church decided that they're going to have an orange shirt day for representing Indigenous people, especially the residential schools, and say, we as a church are going to recognize, and we're going to reinforce that land acknowledgement during those times, I think it would be very appropriate at that point, and
the intention, the prayer for intentions.
Mm-hmm.
So, for myself and Dave, and even our children now, when we go to church and we hear the intentions towards Indigenous people, it really touches them. If
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if some of you were listening to the radio. I was driving and I had we were flipping the channel, and my son landed on Virgin Radio, and on June 30th, there was popular music, I would say, intertwined with stories of residential school survivor. And I mean, my 3 children, because my 4th one wasn't with us, they were all like, are they talking about Indigenous people on Virgin Radio? Like, what's going on? And you heard this lady, Ms. Bear, from Saskatchewan, and they were all like, oh my God, I can't believe we are in the light. Mm-hmm. So that's how I found. I'm glad that it took that tragedy for the bodies of the remain of the bodies of children for Canada to wake up. But when Jesus talks that come out into the light, no more in the darkness. I truly, I hear God speaking to me when I see those things happening in my daily life. So, just to complement the question before, that's why my faith is so strong, because I pray and I could hear God in my daily, actions, and by people coming to talking to me. And one of the things that when we did the bodies were discovered, it happened on the weekend, and we were all shocked. And David is working right now with people from that region, and right away, there was a missing member of their family. They didn't know what happened, and now they're hoping that they're going to find the remain. And it was, all these emotions are like roller coaster. uh, I work with the Cree Board of Health here in Montreal, and we have somebody working in Montreal who has family members found. So it's so close. There's not 6 degrees of separation with Indigenous people. There's probably two or three or
Zero,
four,
zero.
because we're all
Yeah.
really connected. As we travel the land, and it's so poignant. And I remember driving, I think it was on Monday, the phone rings and David was in the car. He's like, oh, it says holy name. We're like, okay, what's going on? So we pick up the phone, and it was actually, Father Joy called me to find out how I was doing, if there was anything he could do. Then the next day was Kevin who called. You know how touched and how reassured we felt. Well, for me, those are evidence that God is truly watching over me through people like Father Peter, Father Joy. So it just reinforces my faith. And like Dave says, I think that, just being here tonight, sharing our stories, and at the end is we want to have this light of hope, and how we can do something and become more aware and change things. We really want to change that. I think I was born for that, to see that change. I hear the call, and I want to make sure that Indigenous people are represented, that we know about their issues and we assist them.
Mhm. And that night, one of the parishioners, when he gave the talk, he apologized. He came up to me, or came out, and I was totally caught by surprise. I'm not shy to admit it. I was weeping when I heard that, because he just said, "Hey, listen, I want to apologize for all my ancestors and anything like wrong that we might have caused, or I've caused, but through that." And that really touched me. That was really, right in here, because it was just pent up chance that people wanted to, and no one wanted to leave. They all wanted to stay. We were just sitting in silence. We were just trying to absorb the moment for about a good 5 minutes before someone said, "Listen, we got to go," but no one wanted to go, because we just wanted to have that collective feeling. So the church is very important for that, and that land acknowledgement, to come back to it. I think the church, each parish has to find its own way of saying, okay, well, what's my role? Right? If we have to do it every Mass to reinforce it, let's do it. If we do it on special occasions, let's do it. We just do it on Aboriginal Day, let's do it. But at the end of the day, the parish has got to find its own way to internalize its own recognition, the way that they decide to recognize.
That's beautiful. Thank you, David, and thank you, Julie. John, is there another question?
Well, I guess one more we got here is on a personal level for the two of you. How did you become Catholic?
There you go, Julie.
So, my mother is French Canadian, and she comes from a big family of 8, and there were 2 children that were called. So one of the sons, one of my mother's brother, sorry, was a priest, and he actually was a missionary, and he went to Pakistan and India at this time. They were one country called India. And when the war broke out, he came back to Canada, and he helped many of them immigrate. And he was a priest. He was French Canadian. He was a priest in an English community, and lots of faith. And my aunt, one of my favorite aunt, was also a nun, and I was really close to her because she had vacations, and she would come to our house I don't know how many weeks she had, but I know she would visit our house for a week, and then she would go to my cousin's house for another week. So, and then my uncle who was priest, they would go together with their other sister who was a widow. They would go together to Wildwood or something, So, I grew up with surrounded by a priest and a nun, and every family dinner, every funeral, there was always the blessing. And I was really, really close to God. And then for a few years, the teenage years or the darker years, I went away from the church. And then with Dave, Dave was already going to Holy Name. So I slowly went back, and became more and more regular and deepened my faith. As you might know, Father Peter organizes a lot of activities, to draw people in, and that's how, knowing Father Peter, there was a lot of committees within the church, and that's how you become more involved, and that's how I guess your faith pushes in a way,
Yeah. I would describe me. No, I've never really left the church. I've always been in there. So just my grandmother, just to give you perspective, my grandmother was go to church every morning, every evening, 3 times on Sunday, and so on and so forth. And I could also remember she used to, have us when we used to go to the Cumberland House, we would be like little ducks, all the kids, and we'd just be following my grandmother. She had a little penknife, and she would cut and the mosquitoes were horrible then, back in the bush. So she cut a little pin, she'd give us all that. We'd have to like flog ourselves, chasing away the mosquitoes all the way to church. So you could just imagine the scene. But those are like the best memories I have of, going to church as a young, and then of course my parents, and always being tied with Holy Name. To give you perspective with Holy Name, I watched that church being built. I lived in the apartments down below, so watched it when I was 3, and when they're blessed in the ground and everything else like that. So I've been going to that church ever since I was 4. So, but to give you a perspective of that, I would describe myself as a C+ Catholic, and probably C- at days, at the very end of the day. But I always felt, like this is the grounding that I have that sort of transcends it. What worries me is when Indigenous people do not get involved in the church, and they lose that sense of heritage. And someone wrote about burning of churches and so on and so forth. And there's another one I think got burned today in Saskatchewan. The residential school survivors are saying, no, we don't want that. At the end of the day, they're making a call for people to stop doing that. I understand the visceral reaction and so on and so forth, behind it, and the emotions behind it. But I completely condemn the act, because at the very end of the day, the church and its embodiment, in terms of its support structures and so on and so forth, they have, they can really work with Indigenous people, but they have to find that Indigenous voice. And again, it's within the laity. I'm part of that laity and reaching into that. So I feel more empowered right now to be part of the church and figure out a way I can bring some amount of reconciliation at this particular juncture, in church. But I never really left it, to be absolutely honest with you. I've always been there, even though I went through a period of not going to church. But it's because I wasn't angry, I was distracted. So but I'm glad I'm Black. I'm glad I'm very active, in my own way.
Okay, I've got another question here, whether you can answer, or maybe some of the clergy that are part of this meeting. Why do you think the Pope is not making the formal apology that's been requested in the Truth and Reconciliation report?
I think there's some legal issues behind that for settlement, but that is one of my things that I will do this summer. I'm going to go on vacation in August. And Dave and I, he's going to support me. We wrote to Pope Francis a few years ago when our company was really, really struggling. We did not know if, that was what he called us to do. And we prayed a lot, and we wrote to the Pope to ask him to help us and to pray for our company and our mission. Like I told you, it was a social mission. And we have the letter in our office to this day. So I would like me and Dave to do that during our vacation, to write to the Pope and to ask him for the apology, because it's not about money, it's not about liability. Like David says, we need an apology to heal. If any one of you has read the reconciliation that took place in South Africa, this is the model. It's like going to the confessional. You know, we need to acknowledge the mistake. We need to hear the pain that was done to these children, to hear those families, to hear the next generation, like myself, you know, how it affected my mother, and how, you know, in his way is dysfunctional. And the same thing, even though, like we talked about Dave's mom that had a positive experience, at the end of the day, she didn't teach the language. So, you know, for me, it's important.
Well, there's, I'll just say very, very quickly, as we're really running out of time, that there is a group of Indigenous leaders and some bishops going to see the Pope in December. And I suspect he's waiting for that to do it in a certain kind of a context. Whether he'll come to Canada is another matter. I mean, he's been Pope for 8 years now. He hasn't even gone to his own country of Argentina. He has very particular agenda of the countries he wants to go to. So anyway, we'll leave it there. I think, John, if there's one more question, quick question, and then we'll have to end so that we have time for our prayer, which is the beginning and the end of all our activities as Christians.
Yeah, I saw there was one question, if I can answer quickly.
Yeah.
Where can you get the t-shirt? If you Google on the internet, Every Child Matters t-shirt, they just released this year's t-shirt. It's a graphic from BC, and they started shipping on June 18th. So you just have to look on the web to see it.
Which website, Julie?
It's vancouverisawesome.com.
Okay.
All together.
John, is there one last question, John?
I guess in terms of time factor, maybe we can stop it here.
Okay, and so Elsa is again. I'll thank you all for your presence. Elsa is going to lead us in the rosary that has graphics and also intentions that David and Julie, I'm not sure, wrote the intentions for each decade, and they're going to participate in the prayer of the Rosary. And maybe Elsa, you can just begin by saying a quick word about the initiative you're having for the children in the parish.
Yes, so just to pick up on recognizing and we at St. Thomas of Becket decided to do an initiative with our children, our families that are enrolled in our what we call Faith First program. So that's the formation of our children, and we put out just an invitation to all families if they wanted to participate in decorating. We have a template of an orange bear, and that of course adults can participate in it as well, where they can just put messages, words from children to in memory of all those children's lives that were lost. We'll display them at St. Thomas of Becket once we've collected them all. We're doing this for a few more weeks, just to give the opportunity for everyone to participate. We'll display them, and then we will be forwarding them to a community, whether you talked about a friendship center this evening, so that's educating myself. I did not know about that, and so perhaps that's where our bears will wind up. So like it wasn't decided yet, but and perhaps Julie and David, you can help us decide where these bears are going to be going. So yes, this is just one way for our families to be in solidarity with.
Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's a great initiative. I love it.
Okay, thank you, Elsa. And so if Alex can get our graphics up, Elsa, we can begin the